I would like to begin by welcoming everybody to On the Same Page, our new learning project. It's very exciting to have so many people join us for this Amida Week learning. We welcome you all across Greater Washington and all the local shiurim and those that are participating via the emails, the video and audio, and please let us know if there's any way that we could be an additional resource for you. I would like to begin talking about the Amud Daf Beis Amud Aleph and Rosh Hashanah with a story that happened to me many years ago when I was living in Eretz Yisrael. It was my grandmother's yahrzeit, and she's buried on Har Zeisim, and I went there to say Tehillim and to daven. And on my way back, after I had done that, I was making my way down the mountain carefully, and I noticed something very unusual in one of the matzevos that I had passed. And it caught my eye. And I turned to look at it more carefully, and what I saw was a secular date. And that's something that's very unusual, not so common on Jewish matzevos, on tombstones, and certainly not in Eretz Yisrael and on Har Zeisim. When I looked more carefully, I saw that the date was September 11th, 2001. So this wasn't just a date, it was really a whole story being conveyed, that the person that was buried here was a tragic victim of the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001. It brings to mind a very interesting question. Nowadays we're all familiar with the count of Brias HaOlam. If we go to a wedding, a Jewish wedding, we pay attention to the person reading the ksuva under the chuppah. We'll hear that date of creation of the world, Anno Mundi, being referenced, which now is 5,778. And we might imagine that that dating system was always used and implemented throughout the Jewish world. What I would like to explore today is that so? Was the dating system from creation, Brias HaOlam, always used? And if not, what other dating systems may have been used, and what were the different factors and halachic considerations and historical circumstances that may have accounted for the various different dating systems? So I begin with our Mishnah on Daf Beis. Arba Rosh Hashanim Heim, there are 4 new years. Be'echad b'Nisan, on the 1st of Nisan, Rosh Hashanah l'Malachim is the new year for the kings. So the Gemara explains, based on the Gemara, on Daf Gimel, this is referring to Jewish kings, and we use this new year to date documents. So for example, a document will say, in the 3rd year of Shlomo HaMelech's reign, Ruvain borrowed $100 from Shimon. Additionally, if it was a time where the Jewish people were under the dominion of a non-Jewish king, it would reference that king. So here, in a very Mishnah, we have 2 different dating systems, the Jewish king and the non-Jewish king. Backing up to the Torah itself, what do we find? The Torah, when we look closely, never references Brias HaOlam, the creation of the world, as a reference point for dating events. What the Torah does use is the Exodus, is Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the Gemara itself is going to reference that to corroborate the fact that we use the dating system from Nisan for Menachem. So, in the Torah itself, we have no dating system from Yetzias Mitzrayim, and in the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, it's exclusively referencing the Exodus, Yetzias Mitzrayim. If we go on to Nach, to Nevi'im and Kesuvim, we find that there, the Malachim, the kings, Jewish kings, non-Jewish kings, Malchi Yehuda, Malchi Yisrael, the northern kings, the southern kings, are used as reference points for dating events. Why were events, like our Mishnah mandates, dated from kings, in particular non-Jewish kings? So the Gemara on Daf Pei in Gittin, it tells us that this was to promote harmonious relationships with the local regime that if we use different dating systems, they may take offense, they may see that as disrespectful of the local government, and therefore that would inject hostilities between the Jewish community and the local government. Whether this is the reason why we used the Jewish kings as well is a discussion in the Rishonim and the Achronim. It's very interesting to note that the Mishnah in Yadayim, it tells us that this dating system was a matter of controversy and discussion between the Tzedukim and the Prushim and the Sadducees, and a Tzeduki from Galil, he actually complained against the Chachamim for using such a dating system, and this is the words in Parak Daled Mishnah Ches in Yadayim. Amar Tzeduki Galili, a certain Tzeduki from the Galil, he said, Kol Balani Aleichem Prushim, I complain against you, Sha'atem Kosvin Es HaMoshel in Moshe Beget. How do you put a non-Jewish ruler together in this divorce document with Moshe Rabbeinu? We all know that the get concludes, Kedas Moshe V'Yisrael, so therefore when you date the document of divorce from a non-Jewish king, you're putting them together, you're equating them, and in fact it would be that the non-Jewish king would actually be first, because that would begin the document with the date, and only conclude with Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Sadduki's claim was that this would be irreverent to Moshe Rabbeinu, and you could look there in Yadayim for the Prushim's sharp retort to that Sadduki. Yerushalmi, the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, gives us additional accounts and dating systems that were used. Betchila hayumonim litzias Mitzrayim. Initially, they counted from the Exodus. Mishen nivne habayis. Once the Beis Hamikdash was built, hischilu limnos lebinyano. They started to count from its building. Lo zachu limnos lebinyano. Hischilu limnos lechurbano. Once the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, was destroyed, they started to count from its churban, from the destruction itself, as a reference point. Lo zachu limnos la'atzman. Hischilu limnos l'malchios. Once even they didn't have their own sovereignty, they started to count from the non-Jewish kings. So we have additional dating systems over here in Yerushalmi, both the building of the temple, the destruction of the temple, and to add to our already different counts that were used. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Yud, it tells us Amar Rav Nachman, Begola ein monin ela l'malcha Yevanim bilvad. In the diaspora, we only use the counting from the Greek kings alone. So this is in the times of the Gemara, and what Rav Nachman is referencing over here is the count of the Seleucid era. So just a little bit historical context. The Seleucid Empire was founded in approximately 312 BC by Seleucus, who was one of the 4 generals of Alexander the Great, the 4 Diadochi, and they had a pretty large empire that was in the Middle East and beyond. And these are actually the characters, the Syrian Greeks, that we're familiar with from the Hanukkah story. And Rav Nachman is saying that this Seleucid era, this counting from the founding of this dynasty, of this empire, is what we use exclusively. The Seleucid Empire, it's important to note, came to an end in 63 BC, when Pompey the Great put out the last emperors of this empire in Syria, and was abolished from then. So this Gemara is taking place many centuries after that, but still the Seleucid era was still being used as a convention for dating years. And it seems like this is the reason why the Gemara says it should be used, because this was something that was widespread and understood by a very large territory of people, and therefore a document that was dated from that time, it would have meaning. An example, if somebody would say in the second year of Jimmy Carter's presidency, that may or may not have meaning to a lot of people, depending on when you were born, but if you said 1977, then that would be understood by the vast majority of the entire world. So the question is, how could the Gemara indeed say in Avodah Zarah that we use the counting from the Seleucid era when our Mishnah, the Mishnah in Gittin, it tells us that we have to use the count from the current regime, and like we said, the Seleucid Empire was long gone in the times of the Gemara. So Tosfos himself is troubled by this question, and he tells us that we have to use the local regime, referred to the local ruler in our documents, is limited to documents of divorce of Gittin. And the rationale Tosfos says for that is because Gittin, documents of divorce, that's something that's very weighty, has great gravitas, is important, and any type of offense or insistence from the local rulership that documents be dated from their regime would be limited to such important documents. But if somebody was merely making a document of a loan, he borrowed $100, for example, that wouldn't be important to reference the local regime. So here we have an additional counting system, the Seleucid era, and in fact, that seemed to have extended into the High Middle Ages. It began to be superseded only perhaps in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, even though perhaps in times of the Gaonim, Brias HaOlam started to be a count, but that did not become widespread till many hundreds of years later, perhaps the 13th century. In fact, in Egypt, the Seleucid era was used as the dating system until the 16th century, when the Rabbis abolished it in Egypt. In fact, in Yemen, it seems like this dating system from the Seleucid era is used until our modern times. And that's based on the Gemara in Avodah Zarah that says that this is the count that we use. A good example of seeing these different counts, and even in one place, is the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah in Parak Yod, Hilchos Shmita V'Yovel, and he says, Lufi Cheshbon Zeh, according to this calculation that he mentioned before, Shana Zu Sheishnas Elef Umeya V'Sheva L'Churban, this year, which is 1107 from the destruction of the temple, Sheishnas Sheva Ushmonim V'Elef V'Arba Meyos L'Minim Shtaros, which is 1487 from the Seleucid era, which is referred to as Minin Shtaros, Shishnas Sheish Ushloshim V'Tesha Meyos V'Arbas Alefim Litzira, which is 4,936 years from creation. So we see over here, just in this one Rambam, these different counts that are being used and referenced, and it seems like the Seleucid era, even in the 12th century, when the Rambam was writing this, was still something that was used and prevalent, and the Rambam indeed references it. It was only a little bit later that the count from Brias HaOlam totally superseded it in at least most areas in Europe and the Middle East. So nowadays, we know that Brias HaOlam is used, superseded the Seleucid era, the other counts, and the question is, how does that fit with all the things that we learned in our Mishnah, that we need to reference the local rulership? And for other documents outside of a get, we already said that Tosfos told us that there's no offense taken, it wasn't necessary to do that. But we have to understand how divorce documents, Gittin, nowadays are dated from Brias HaOlam, and that seems to contradict the Mishnah in Gittin that tells us that a get that's used with any other count besides the local regime is invalid. So in fact, Tosfos and Daf Pei in Gittin asks this question, and he tells us that nowadays, even the Gentile society, the non-Jewish people, they don't use the count of the local ruler, of the local king. That's not something that's they're accustomed to. So therefore, the Jewish people also don't need to, it wouldn't be perceived as any slight to the local rulership. So in conclusion, the answer to our question, was the creation always used as a dating system, is a resounding no. Rather, there were many different systems, dating systems, that were used throughout history, and that we have now, the count from Anna Mundi, or from Bria Sa'olam, the creation of the world, is an evolution of complex historical events. The different counts that we mentioned come out to 7. You see as Mitzrayim, the building of the temple, the destruction of the temple, Jewish kings, non-Jewish kings, the Seleucid era, and finally, Brias Ha'olam. I'd like to conclude by just asking, is there any reference in our Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph to the count of Brias Ha'olam that we're so familiar with today? And it doesn't seem like that. However, if you look at the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos, he indeed says on the clause over here of B'echad B'Tishrei Rosh Hashanah L'Shanim, this is a reference to the count of Brias Ha'olam. And the Rambam apparently is understanding this according to the Gemara in Daf Ches, which says Tekufa is one of the 3 different ways to explain what Shana means, and that's the way the Rambam understands Tekufa, that it's a reference to Yitzira, and that's a contrast to Rashi and Tosfos, how they understand Tekufa, which is talking about complex astronomical calculations.